Hello, my name is Adam Maxwell. I'm the lead designer here at Soulbound Studios, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about our game Chronicles of Elyria. Specifically, I wanted to talk about the process that we go through to generate the worlds that our players will experience. I guess first I should start with a little background in case you're new to the experience here. Chronicles of Elyria is a multiplayer evolving online world. It's not just simply a hack and slash adventure or even your typical MMORPG. Instead, it's a simulation of an actual place, a world where people live and die, they grow old, they marry, they have children, they set out on adventures, or they just live a simple life as a farmer or a trader, or perhaps they have grander ambitions and instead take the crown and rule a kingdom. One of the things that's a cornerstone for Chronicles of Elyria is that players take the course of the world, the fate of the entire planet, into their own hands. Everything players do leaves a mark on the world. Player involvement in shaping the course of the world is very important to us. One of the things that we did was allow our players to vote on what each of the server's world maps would look like. Typically, when a world map is created for an online game, it's created by a team of artists and designers working together to build a perfectly curated experience. However, Chronicles of Elyria is a much bigger world than your typical MMORPG, and we realized that if we really wanted to build the living, breathing simulation that we needed, then we couldn't really rely on typical hand-curated methods. And so everything that we build is in fact procedurally generated. I'm going to actually walk you through a little bit of that process today. First, I'll start by showing you an image of the actual maps that we've voted on before. In fact, I'll show you map H, which was one of the maps that actually wasn't chosen by our communities. It's just one of my personal favorites and one that we use as a test map here. In the first image that you've seen, you can see what we call the relief map of map H. It's basically a combination of the physical 3D geometry and the resource distribution in the form of colors that makes it sort of look like, your typical satellite view of a map. In fact, though, this was created through a rather complicated process. We could not hand build the terrain, so instead, we actually build our continent outlines procedurally in a program that we wrote. And then from there, we populate each of them with information that tells our systems what kinds of environments, what we call biomes, that you might experience. In fact, a biome map is basically these sort of 16 colors filling the shape of the continent. Once we have our biome mask, we can then pull it into a terrain generation system such as World Machine, and we can begin to build the complicated algorithms that actually create the physical traits of each of those environments based on that mask. And so rather than, say, for example, placing every tree in a woody swamp or placing all of the water locations in a wetlands, we tell the system, hey, this is a swamp, or hey, this is a wetlands. And then based on that decision, it loads up one of our several algorithms within World Machine and then creates terrain that sort of follows the rules of that type of environment based on the shape of the biome that we've sent it in our biome mask. Every biome has different elements that determine sort of different features. For example, in the large mountainous Rocky Mountain steppes, in this case in the northwest of our map, one of the things that we have to deal with is the fact that it's a very mountainous region, but it's also very, very high elevation. And so there are rules for where the snow line begins, where the trees can form. And these things will change even at this level, the color distribution on the map. So that, for example, if you're above the tree line, you'll see exposed rocky mountains as opposed to, lush green hills or green ridges or things of that nature. In other biomes, however, there are different concerns. For example, as we move into the lower montane or the broadleaf and mixed leaf forests, those mountains start to become more like rolling hills, and those rolling hills create valleys and various other features that can then be used to propagate tree growth or be used by even the tribes that live there as places to build their settlements, etc. In fact, in some cases, the physical features of a biome are part of what decides how survivable it is. A good example of this would be our semi-arid desert. There's very little water in the semi-arid desert, and so things like farming aren't necessarily possible. I mean, possible maybe isn't the right word, but they're definitely very difficult. However, one of the defining features of the biome are these sort of flat-topped mesas. And those mesas create different conditions around them, some of which may be more conducive to settlement or growth or even farming. Additionally, those mesas actually have caves in them. And if you're the Weird, our desert-dwelling tribe, those caves may be a way for you to be able to trap and harvest water. And of course, in the desert, water is life. And so those mesas can literally make the difference between being able to settle in the region or not. Every biome has its own set of complicated rules as defined by its algorithm, as defined by these graphs of wires and shapes that you see. Every shape represents a manipulation of the terrain. Every wire represents the input or output of that manipulation, which you can see they definitely all sort of depend on each other. And through this sort of complex set of manipulations, we end up with the three-dimensional terrain and a rough resource distribution in the form of the color map for the biome. Once we have that, we can actually begin to render out the height field as well as the additional resource data. And when we do, this will actually generate two basic images for us. One is the simple relief map, a black and white image. We actually, in the industry, call them a height field. I'm sure we're not alone in that. In a height field, black represents the lowest possible altitude, whereas bright white represents the highest possible altitude, and then every shade of gray in between represents, a level of change, so that you'll see mountain peaks rise from dark gray or black all the way up to bright white, or you'll see valleys form as darker gray areas between brighter hills. Of course, the relief map is only one part of the equation at this point. In addition to the relief map, we also have the color map. The color map represents more than just the colors necessary to make it look like real terrain. They actually represent the resource distribution in the region, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. For example, if we look at the mesas, in our color map here, we can see that they're this bright orange color. They're this bright orange color specifically so that our algorithm could denote, hey, these are important pieces of terrain that have very specific properties. Whenever you see this color, understand that this color represents mesas and treat them as such. And as far as what it means to be a mesa, we actually have a series of data files that we use from this step of the process on to help refine the data that gets generated by our procedural content systems. So our system may look at that orange map and say, aha, this is a mesa. Well, the soil around a mesa is this particular type, and you can find these particular resources there. But additionally, mesas are only in the semi-arid desert, which means that this level of humidity and these temperature ranges apply. And as a result, that means that the resources are going to be distributed this way. And then using that information, it can actually build the data set necessary for our game to know where the mineral resources or the foraging resources or the game resources can be found for each of the various biomes. In fact, some biomes have no game resources or no easily accessible mineral resources. The semi-arid desert is a really good example of a place where it's very difficult to farm. However, that's not the only set of data that we actually supply the system with as well. Every biome has a very detailed profile which specifies the conditions that can be found within: average rainfall, temperature and humidity, as I mentioned before, resource distribution, the soils that can be found there, even the industrial and commercial trades that can thrive in that area based on those resources. That information is then used by the system to further create new details. For example, knowing where the resources can be found in the semi-arid desert and knowing where the water can be found in the semi-arid desert helps us determine where the settlements might be located within that area. Once we know where the settlements might be located in terms of survivability, we can then look at the resources and other factors in the area to determine what sort of commercial or trade focus it might have. And once we understand the trade focus of a settlement, once we understand what it does to make its living, we can then take that information and actually begin to construct the settlement itself. Based on survivability, we understand how large it can be, which tells us which of our 5 size classes it can be. Is it a hamlet? Is it a village? Is it a town? Is it a city? Is it a capital? But more importantly, we can actually determine, based on the data that we supply it, what kinds of buildings could be found there. Well, if it's a mining town, it's probably going to have a foundry so that it can smelt its output. Likewise, if it's an iron town, it might have a blacksmith who produces weapons or other trade goods that could then be traded out to other people. And if trade is how it makes its money, well, then it's very likely going to have a trading post and maybe even the beginnings of a trade route, the head of a major road, for example. All of this information that allows our system to make these decisions are stored in these files that we've built over the last couple of years as we've researched each of the biome conditions and how life in medieval times actually operated, so that we could then, like I said, populate this town. And once we understand what a town is for and how many people it can support, we can actually generate the buildings that would go into that settlement. And once we know what structures are there, we can actually understand what jobs to give the population. As I mentioned before, we understand how many people live there. So now we know they're miners or smiths or traders or some combination of all of the above. And as we do, we can then generate the literal NPC that will occupy those positions within the city or town or village or hamlet, thus creating the actual population of the world in addition to just the locations of its cities and other settlements. And of course, once all of these are placed, we can then actually determine things like how rich a particular kingdom is, or which duchies within a kingdom have which particular focuses. And then we can begin to make larger scale strategic decisions, such as which settlements might have an additional focus on defense or trade, or where the road networks within a kingdom might exist. And of course, at this point, we also understand all of the environmental factors of each biome. This allows us to run complex simulations, such as a water flow simulation, to determine the state of the water table beneath the surface. Using this information, we can also determine the likely locations of rivers and lakes, waterfalls, or other such features, which can then influence things like where the bridges and fords and other crossings are as they meet roads and rivers. This can in turn influence some of the commercial focuses of a city. A settlement on the coast might have a fishing focus at first. However, with ready access to lumber, a large economic base and an area rich in resources, it might decide that it wants to be a shipwright instead, at which point its NPCs can be assigned new jobs and it can change as a result. And thus the beating economic system of each of our kingdoms, and thus the entire world, begins to take shape. While it's not an easy process, all of this is necessary to create the sort of stage for adventure that a multiplayer evolving online world demands. It's not enough to have static storylines or quests that everybody takes, or even, the sort of simple, here's a to-do list from a guy in the village kind of approach. What we want is a world that lives and stands on its own, so that when I join the world, I don't join the world as the chosen one. I join the world as I'm one member of its massive population that's all going about their lives and creating the sort of legacy and history of the world as they do. That way I can rise above that and make my own mark on the world if I want to. But on the other hand, I could live contentedly as a farmer in the middle of nowhere. The choice is up to me, because that's what a living online world is about. Of course, building a world isn't easy. And it's not really pretty either. For every decision that we make, we generate a massive amount of data, and operating on that massive amount of data can be very difficult. In fact, in order to create the world, we had to build our world generation software so that it runs on machines in the cloud, machines with 72 cores and 199 gigabytes of RAM, the kinds of things you wouldn't normally see on a desktop. However, once that data is generated, it can very easily be packaged up for use by our servers so that we don't necessarily need the same large hardware to actually run the game. It's just necessary for the process, because when we make these decisions, we have to be able to look at all of the world at once, or as close to that as we can get with the hardware that's available of today. Of course, all that really matters is the result. And as I mentioned, the goal here is to build a living, breathing world a massive stage for adventure and exploration and even day-to-day life. And so, while we work with this massive mountain of data, what it really comes down to is what it feels like as a player. Does it feel like a real living, breathing world? Does it feel vast? Does it feel like there's more to explore than you'd ever see in a lifetime? Or does it feel small and restricted, like a diorama or a set on a movie? For us, the goal has always been a world large enough that each and every one of us can find our own niche, our own place, a world that was full of potential. And we think with our world generation system, we've created that. In fact, let me show you a couple of quick visualizations that our art team put together, just using our test map data here. Now, of course, you're not going to see a lot of detail here. These aren't fully realized game worlds. This is just test map data. But using the test map data, I think you'll get an idea of our scale. For example, let's get an idea of what a village might look like in the semi-arid desert. As we come over the mesas, you might expect to see a large cluster of buildings. And in fact, there is one. That's those white specks there. As we get closer, you can begin to see that they're the shapes of houses. In fact, that little black speck there, it's actually a person, a player. In fact, as we zoom in, you can begin to see just exactly how big just the desert is, 1/16 of the world. If we were to take that entire world and say, view it from space, and then zoom into a village like this, you would probably get a better sense of the scope and scale of the world. So why don't we do that? Hopefully, as you can see, Elyria isn't a place where you're going to walk from one end of the continent to another in just an hour or two. It's a place where making a trip around the world is an actual adventure, something to look forward to, an ambition to have. And we think that that's necessary for a world to feel real. And of course, that's always been the goal with Chronicles of Elyria. Hope you enjoy the video. We'll see you next week.